Thank you, Sandy. First, I want to say thank you to Gene for taking the time today to give us a great presentation on his operation and how he has made no-till and cover crops a part of his system. I think most of you probably know Gene's a really good influencer in this county, and we really appreciate his efforts and work towards conservation and sharing his experiences and how he makes things work. So we greatly appreciate that. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the basics of no-tilling into corn, and then getting into more of planting green into cover crops. I know there's probably several of you that are starting to think about that, or possibly were forced to do that a couple of years ago in the spring of 19 when it was really wet. So no-tilling with corn, as always, even in conventional corn, uniformity is key. I know we all want that each corn plant to come up at the exact same time, and grow at the same rate. That really helps with yield, and that's true even in no-till. So what do we know? We know being patient is the most important thing. That means you're not going to get out there when your neighbor does. So taking the time, waiting for the correct soil conditions. You may have to plant soybeans first or start planting soybeans first until soil temperatures get to more suitable condition, or for soils to dry out. We know for a fact that you will have failure if you do no-till in wetter soils. That's just a part of the problems with no-till, is having to be patient and waiting. Plant deeper. We know if we can get an inch and a half, 2 inches, some are even going as deep as 3 inches in depth, the seed will make it through that depth. And what we're getting there is consistent soil temperatures. So in a tilled system, we work that top of the soil so we get that heat so the plant really takes off sooner. In no-till, it is true we have colder, wetter soils. So if we can get that seed deeper, the heat units within the soil become more consistent, which allows those plants or those seeds to germinate at the same time, instead of having them all in the top inch, where a pocket may get warmer because it gets more sunlight. So that's going to germinate first. It's really important to keep those seeds 1.5 inches, 1.75 inches, 2 inches. Really starts becoming your preference once you get after 1.5 inches, to really set those seeds to a level where they're going to get the same heat at the same time to germinate. Invest in your planter. The planter is probably the most important piece of equipment when it comes to no-till. You're not going to be doing any kind of tillage, so the soil is going to be exactly how it was after you got done harvesting. So really take the time and invest in proper openers. Those are probably the most important part, because that's what's going to cut the seed trench for you. You want to make sure they are sharp, make sure they are close together. The rule of thumb is if you can take a business card and slide it through the openers, the two openers, and it gets just kind of stuck, you've got them set close enough. You want to make sure they're quality steel. Don't cheap out on openers. Make sure they're quality steel, and especially around the hub. That's where you're going to get a lot of wear and tear, is right there at the hub. As you go through several acres, they're going to wear there the fastest. So make sure you have quality steel for the openers. Your planter doesn't have to be brand new. It doesn't have to have all the bells and whistles either. So you can take the current planter you have and invest in, new openers, the row closing system that you think is going to work best for you, and some additional seed firmers to really make it work for you. Down pressure is another really important thing, especially if the soil gets dry. The harder the soil that gets, we want to make sure we're getting that seed into the soil at a consistent depth. So making sure you've got the right down pressure. And then again, as I said, seed firmers, something to reduce that seed from bouncing once it goes into the seed trench, to make sure those seeds all stay at the same uniform depth. And it also gets that good seed to soil contact. Closing wheels or closing systems, everyone does something different. It is a personal preference, whether you run spike wheels, whether you run just firmers. Big thing with spike wheels to make sure is you're not getting hairpinning, which is basically setting those too aggressive. The last thing you want those to do is to come down around your seed and lift it up or push residue down onto the seed. So make sure those closing wheels, if you use spiked ones, aren't too aggressive, aren't getting too deep into the soil to actually mess with the seed that we just placed. But it's really a personal preference. So some guys will run, half their planter with one or every other row with something until they figure out what they think works best for them. Be meticulous. When it comes to no-tilling, you can't cut corners. There's just no cutting corners when it comes to doing no-tilling, especially no-till corn. You got to get out in the field after planting whatever, 100 feet, 200 feet, get out, really walk every row, check the seed depth, make sure that it's getting to where you want it to be as far as depth is and is consistent in spacing. And if you have a field that has multiple soil types, it's not a terrible idea to stop when you hit different soil types. So you might go 2, 3, 4 rows or 4 passes and get out and check again. It really will pay off for you the more time you get out of the tractor. Stop, look things over, make sure things are going the way you want. One of the best quotes that I've heard a lot of the no-till speakers talk on is the best thing is to see your shadow out in that field. So you want to get out there, you want to dig each seed up every few feet, make sure you're getting that proper depth, make sure the row is closing correctly, getting that seed covered, and just being meticulous with it, making sure that it's doing what you want it to do. Now, when it comes to no-tilling green into cover crops, this is a newer part of the journey. For those of you who have been doing cover crops for a few years, you may have experienced this already once or twice. I know in 2019, we had a good amount of producers that had to end up doing this in the end of June. If you're gonna plant green into a cover crop that's standing, or if you're gonna lay it down, make sure the equipment that you're using to crimp it or to lay it down matches or can be ran to match the width of your planter. Do not run your planter against the way you have laid the cover crop down. That we know for a fact that is 100% recipe for major headaches and frustration, and even if it's a couple of rows. So don't cheat on that. If you have a 20-foot planter, but you only have a 15-foot crimping tool, you're going to need to figure out how to make that work to be lined up the same way if it has to be overlapped a few feet here or there. So do not short on that. If you can't get it to line up, it can be done with it standing. That kind of goes back to some of the things with closing wheels. If you're using spiked ones, you're probably going to get binding, and you're probably going to need to stop every so often and unbind them, or definitely each field. But it can be done. Guidance is the most important thing there. If you've got RTK or some kind of guidance, you'll make your way through it. I know I heard some stories from 19 of guys out there trying to figure out which way they were going, but they got it done. So having guidance in some of these taller systems or taller cover crops is definitely a benefit. And if you don't, you might have to get creative. There's ways to get through it, and we can do it. Make sure you finish the job. So even though you're going to lay this cover crop down, most likely you're not going to actually terminate or kill off every cover crop that you're laying down. So it's really important to come back with your herbicide application, 48 to 72 hours after you lay it down. So say you lay it down and then plant into it the next day or later in that day, It's really important to come back then the next day or the third day and make sure you spray that field, get that cover crop terminated. That way it doesn't start standing back up for you. So make sure you finish these cover crops off once you lay them down, or they can start standing back up. And then this is true not just for planting green into cover crops, but for planting into any cover crop residue. You really should try to know your carbon to nitrogen ratio of your cover crop, because that is going to directly affect how much nitrogen your crop needs as it gets started and coming out of the ground and growing. The last thing we want to see is you to short your crop on nitrogen and end up with a stunted crop or shorter yield than you wanted. So you will need to adjust your nutrient systems, your nitrogen applications, either add more before you plant or at planting or right after planting and side dress to keep that crop fed and keep the nutrients to it that it needs to get going and get growing right out of this cover crop residue. As that cover crop gets taller, especially cereal rye, it really starts taking or becoming more carbon than nitrogen. So for that to decompose, you're going to need more nitrogen, or it's going to take more nitrogen out of the ground to decompose it. And that's where your corn crop may start getting robbed. So, 2-3 feet tall isn't as much as 4 or 5 feet or 6 feet tall. I know most guys are keeping things under 2 foot. The carbon to nitrogen ratio isn't too terribly high then, but it's still not a bad idea to either put a little more on right before planting or at planting, just to make sure that that crop gets going and doesn't get stunted right off the bat from lack of nutrients. And then stick with it. Start small. You don't have to do your entire operation. You don't have to do 100 acres. A no-till planter will work in tilled soil. So if you set your planter up for no-till and you decide to only no-till 30 acres, well, that's great. No-till the 30 acres, you're going to be able to still use that same planter setup in your tilled fields. It's still going to all work the same. There's no need to have to stop or change it or anything like that. You can still use it. A successful no-till, I know I waited till the end to say this. I think Gene probably said it earlier than I have, but really starts at harvest. And I guess I waited till the end because I know we're past harvest already this year and heading into planting. But it really does start at harvest. And it's really important that your combine evenly distributes the residue out of it. The last thing we really need in a no-till system is having 6, 8, 10, 12, foot and a half depth of residue, even if it's just soybean stubble or soybean residue to go through. That will affect seed placement and seed depth in those rows. So we really need to focus in the fall as we get into more of a consistent no-till system of making sure our combine is evenly and as thoroughly as we can distributing residue across every swath it can. I know some of the technology is getting better as we get wider combine heads, that they're starting to get there. I know 4 or 5 years ago, that was kind of a problem. Most combines would only get 15, 20 feet, 25 feet, and heads were getting 30 to 40 feet. So they're starting to catch up with that. Just make sure you can cover as evenly across the swath behind the combine as much as you can. And then minimize your challenges. Don't go into this blind. Don't go into this thinking, hey, I can do this, without really forethinking into it, because that will set you up for failure. Find somebody that you know or that you've heard is doing some no-till, bounce questions off of them, get some feedback from them, learn what they've had to overcome. Do your own research, reading articles, looking up, extension papers, looking up seed papers, all of those, really dig into some of the research and then figure out what people have overcame already so you can hopefully avoid that. And then consult with your local conservation professionals, Purdue Extension, NRCS, SWCD, state Department of Agriculture. We're all here to assist you to get over these challenges or to bounce ideas off of, or to discuss how your operation might make this transition. And then take it upon yourself to document your successes and failures. I think you've heard probably from Gene earlier and other farmers who have discussed no-till. There's mistakes every year, there's challenges every year. And it's documenting those, remembering those, and planning for next year as early as you can to learn from those experiences. That is all I actually have. So, it's pretty straightforward, pretty simple. I think Gene and I are going to be around here for the next few minutes to take questions, and we look forward to those. So thank you.